In Next.js projects, we have two environments where we can render our components and generate HTML markup, either on the client within a web browser or on the server within a Node.js runtime. Rendering components on the client is similar to how React applications work. We refer to this technique as client-side rendering or CSR. On the flip side, we have server-side rendering or SSR, where components are rendered on the server. So what are the differences? Well, with client-side rendering, we have to bundle all our components and send them to the client for rendering. This means as our application grows, so does our bundle size because it must contain all of our components. Now, the larger the bundle, the more memory we need on the client to load all these components. So this approach is resource heavy. The other problem is that search engine bots, which are machines that browse and index our websites, can't view our content because they can't execute JavaScript code, so they cannot render our components like a web browser. And last but not least, any sensitive data we have in our components or their dependencies, like API keys, will be exposed to the client. Now, if we render our components on the server, we can get rid of all these problems. We only send the essential components to the client and prevent our bundle from becoming unnecessarily large. Also, because the server handles most of the rendering, we need less resources on the client. Plus, because rendering is done on the server and we send the actual content to the client, search engine bots can view and index our pages. And finally, we can keep sensitive data like API keys on the server. So these are all the great benefits of server-side rendering. However, with server-side rendering, we lose interactivity. So server components, which are components that are rendered on the server, cannot listen to browser events like click, change, submit, and so on. They cannot access browser APIs like the local storage. They cannot maintain state or use effects. These functionalities are only available in client components. So in real-world applications, we often use a mixture of server and client components. We should default to server components and use client components only when we absolutely need them. Here is an example. Let's imagine we want to build a page to show a list of products. To build this page, we probably need several components like navbar, sidebar, product list, product card, pagination, and footer. Now, in standard React applications, we have to package all these components and send them to the client for rendering. But in Next.js, we can keep all these components on the server and minimize the bundle size. There is just one exception. To add a product to a shopping cart, we need to handle the click event of a button. Typically, we implement this functionality in the product cart component, so we have to make it a client component. That's one option, but there's a better way. We can keep this component on the server and do most of the rendering there, and instead extract a small component that only contains the add button. With this change, we only ship that tiny component to the client and keep everything else on the server. Let's see this in action. Back to our project. In Next.js, all components inside the app folder are server components by default. So that means all the pages we have created so far, these are server components and are rendered on the server. Let me show you. So back to the browser. Let's bring up the network tab and look at the first request. This is the HTML document that we get from the backend. So look, we have our content here, we have our hello world and the user's link. This is exactly what search engine bots see when they browse our website. In contrast, if we used client-side rendering, which is how standard React applications work, search engine bots wouldn't be able to see our content. They would see a blank page because all components, all the content is rendered on the client. Okay? So back to our project. All components inside the app folder are server components by default. Now, if you have worked with Next.js before, I should mention that the pages router doesn't support server components. So going forward, you should stop using it and switch to the new app router. Okay? Now let's create a new folder here called components. Earlier, I told you that this folder is not publicly accessible unless we add a page file inside it. So that means we can co-locate our project files like our components and other building blocks with our pages. We can put them next to each other, and this is perfectly fine. So here in the components folder, let's add a new file called product card.tsx. Here we create a basic React component. Now, earlier I told you that server components cannot have interactivity. So they cannot handle browser events like click, change, and so on. So that means if we add a button here and handle the click event, we get a runtime error. Let me show you. So let's pass a basic error function and log something on the console. And we set the label to add to cart. Now let's add this component to our home page. So we go to our first page file and add our new product card component. Now back to the browser. Look, we got an error saying event handlers cannot be passed to client component props. If you need interactivity, consider converting part of this to a client component. Now here we have two options. One option is to make this entire component a client component. So we go to the top and use the client directive. So in quotes, we type use client. That's all we have to do. With this, we tell the Next.js compiler to include this file or this component in our JavaScript bundle. And that means if this component is dependent on other components, those components will automatically become client components and will be included in our JavaScript bundle. So we don't have to repeat this directive on every client component, okay? So here's one option. Now, if you go back to the browser, the error is gone. But there is a better way. To make our applications faster and more search engine friendly, we want to render our components on the server as much as possible and use client components only when absolutely necessary. So here, our product card could have some complex markup. We want to render all that markup on the server and move this button to the client. So I'm going to extract this button and put it inside a separate component. So here in the components folder, let's add a new file, add to cart. Again, we create a basic React component. On the top, we use the client directive, and then we move this button to our new component. Like this. Okay, so now we have a client component, and we're going to use this in our product card. Okay, with this, we can remove use client from this file. So this component will be rendered on the server. And that means where we have a client component, in this case, where we have this button, there's going to be a hole or a slot where React will later inject our client component. Okay, now if you go back to the homepage, again, we don't see any errors. So this is how we can create and use client and server components.